tonight, we travel not through the grand halls of kings or the blood-stained fields of battle, but through the quieter, itchier corners of history. You're welcome here, wherever you're listening from. Whether it's a stormy city window, a quiet countryside bed, or somewhere in between, let the day fall away. Let the distractions soften. And join me for a story that is, quite simply, uncomfortable in all the most ancient ways. Because for thousands of years, no matter who you were or where you lived, something was always crawling beneath the surface, on your skin, in your bedding, sometimes even in your belly. Parasites. The word alone stirs unease. It's meant to. These were the uninvited guests that didn't knock. They made homes in hair, in intestines, under fingernails, between toes. They didn't care if you were a pharaoh, a priest, or a peasant girl in a mud hut. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the frozen north to the steaming jungles of the Nile, ancient people did their best to live with them. And when they couldn't, they prayed. They panicked. They scratched until they bled. And they came up with all manner of treatments, from holy herbs and fiery oils to dangerous metals and gut-churning rituals. In some places, you might have worn a charm shaped like a coiled worm to protect yourself from the real thing. In others, you might have swallowed bitter roots soaked in honey if you were lucky, or chewed on mercury-dipped bark if you were desperate. Parasites weren't just pests. They were teachers of humility. No matter how high you climbed in society, a single louse could undo your dignity. A single worm could bring down a soldier, a ruler, a prophet. They became symbols of guilt, of punishment, of impurity, and yet they were also common enough to bind all humans in a secret shame. Everyone itched, everyone bled, everyone prayed to be clean. And that's what we're exploring tonight. Not the gore, not the horror, but the quiet struggle, the hidden world of humans versus the microscopic miseries that never left them alone. We'll walk through lice-filled temples and damp cottages. We'll listen in on whispered cures and sacred incantations. We'll see how a Roman aristocrat handled a belly worm, and what a Chinese healer would prescribe for invisible skin mites. We'll meet saints said to cure parasites with a glance, and housewives who simply boiled their laundry and hoped for the best. And yes, we'll reflect on just how much cleaner and lonelier modern life has become. But for now, let the world grow quiet around you. The flicker of the candle, the hush of distant wind, maybe the soft rustle of bedding, let those settle you. This won't be a horror story. It's a history of scratching, soothing, suffering, and survival. Because through all the cures and failures, the truth is this: our ancestors endured, and that, somehow, is oddly comforting. Before you fully settle in, if you find comfort in these quiet journeys through forgotten history, consider gently tapping the like button or subscribing if you'd like to join me again sometime. And in the stillness of the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time the night found you. It's always a quiet joy to see how far these stories travel. Imagine this. You wake in the dead of night, in a small stone room, walls cool with moisture, air thick with incense and straw dust. You reach to scratch your shoulder and feel it, the telltale tickle. Not one, not two. A quiet army of itches. You don't scream. You don't panic. You've known this feeling your whole life. You were born into it. In ancient times, no one expected their body to be theirs alone. It belonged, at least in part, to the things that lived on it. Things that chewed, burrowed, sipped, and slithered, without invitation and without apology. And so, ancient people devised rituals. In Egypt, a young mother might rub her child's scalp with a paste made from date pits and garlic, whispering a blessing to Isis for protection against the lice. In Rome, a soldier returning from the front might stop by a street healer to drink a bitter cup, one that would, supposedly, encourage the worm to leave. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the worm left through the wrong end. There were powdered herbs meant to kill fleas and insects that supposedly drove them out. People bathed in vinegar. They brushed their skin with ash. They pressed leeches to their bellies and prayed to obscure gods of rot and healing. They burned their clothes or hid tiny charms under their mattresses, little figures carved from bone or ivory, shaped like serpents or bloated men. And sometimes, when the cures failed, they just learned to live with it, because parasites were not just physical, they were spiritual, symbolic. In many cultures, they were believed to be sent by gods or demons, punishments for unclean thoughts or unresolved sins. A man plagued by worms might confess to adultery. A child scratching her scalp raw might be doused in sacred oil and prayed over, not treated. Sometimes the healer wasn't a doctor, but a priest, or a mother, or simply time. Parasites became part of the furniture of life. And still, ancient people tried. They tried to understand. Some believed worms were born from rotten fruit or spontaneous filth in the gut. Others thought fleas appeared through curses or seasonal winds. The Babylonian Talmud, the Ayurvedic texts, and the lost scrolls of Alexandria each had their theories, their cures, their failures. Even the most educated physician in ancient Greece might prescribe honey mixed with crushed copper and say, with grave certainty, that the spirits of the worms will be lured into the sweetness and drowned. And sometimes they were right. Oddly enough, in their superstitions and errors, the ancients stumbled upon truths. Wormwood really can expel certain parasites. Garlic, for all its ritual use, has antibacterial properties. And bathing, when it could be done, did help. But bathing wasn't always possible, and not everyone could afford clean water, much less privacy. So they endured, they scratched, they soothed, they whispered to themselves in the dark. And over time, they passed their methods down, through lullabies, through cautionary tales, through scribbled marginalia in a monk's prayer book. Parasites didn't care about class or creed. A noblewoman in silk might lift her wig to reveal lice bites. A desert prophet might stop mid-sermon to double over in pain from an intestinal visitor. A slave, a merchant, a monk, all bore the same burdens beneath the surface. And that's what makes this story so strangely human, because for all our modern comforts, this was once everyone's reality, that your own body might turn on you, that the unseen could humble the mighty, that survival often meant not conquest or glory, but simply not scratching too loudly during morning prayers. So tonight, we'll explore their methods, their beliefs, their quiet, squirming fears, and their resilience. We'll walk alongside them, not to gawk or grimace, but to understand, to respect, to nod quietly at the simple truth. They itched, they suffered, they carried on, just like us. Before we had words like epidemiology or hygiene, we had something far simpler: itching, relentless, persistent itching. Let's begin in a sun-baked village along the Nile. Sometime around 1500 BCE, the mud brick homes are warm even at night, holding in the heat of the day like slow-burning ovens. The air inside is thick, not just with the scent of barley porridge and reed mats, but with the cloying odor of sweat, clay, and something else, the faint, musty tang of hair infested. In one such home, a mother sits with her child between her knees. She's combing through the child's scalp with a fine-toothed bone comb, not for vanity, though vanity exists, but for survival. The comb pulls out little gray bodies, clinging tightly to the roots of hair. Some are alive, some are not. Some burst softly between her fingers. She doesn't flinch. This is just what you do before bed. Head lice were not a rare curse in the ancient world. They were an expected part of daily life, like dust, hunger, or the rising of the river. In Egypt, we know from tomb paintings and archaeological lice remnants in mummies that even well-off citizens, priests, scribes, high-ranking officials weren't spared. Lice combs have been found tucked into burial wrappings, as if the deceased might need them in the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets list treatments for what they called the walking sickness of the scalp, involving aromatic oils, ground seeds, and the ashes of burnt barley. Whether it worked is unclear, but the belief was strong, and sometimes belief was half the battle. Children, especially, were most at risk. They played in the dirt, cuddled animals, shared bedding with siblings. A single infested goat could could bring a colony of blood drinkers into an entire household by morning. At night, you didn't just lay down to rest. You lay down to scratch. Beds, if you were lucky enough to have one, were stuffed with straw or reeds, ideal for warmth, but also a haven for mites and fleas. Some families slept under mosquito nets or burned herbal smoke, hoping to drive out the biting spirits. Others simply endured. An Egyptian scribe once wrote a lament, comparing the misery of an unwashed bed to being chained to the itch of the gods. The problem was not only the biting, but the social implications of being known as someone infested. Scratching too often in public marked you. It could cost you a promotion, a marriage match, or temple access. And yet, everyone scratched. Just a little, just enough to pretend it was something else. Hairstyles were adapted accordingly. Like Flocky rolled, shaving the scalp, and wearing a wig was common, not just for style or status, but for cleanliness. Hair could hide lice. A bald head could be scrubbed. Wigs, despite being elaborate and elegant, were often made from human or horsehair, and were no better when it came to pests. In fact, many people owned more than one wig not for fashion, but because while one was being boiled or sun-baked to kill lice, they still needed something to cover their head. Oils were used liberally: castor oil, cedarwood, even animal fat, to coat the hair and skin. Some believed this suffocated lice. Others thought it simply made the wearer too slippery to bite. Either way, the shine of oil became a daily ritual, equal parts protection, prayer, and polish. Still, infestation spread quickly. No one had personal space. Families slept close. Slaves and servants slept beside livestock. Visitors brought more than news. They brought eggs, nits, and things that crept into the corners of rooms. And in those rooms, people whispered. They shared home remedies passed down through generations. Rubbing crushed mint into the scalp, placing hot sand beneath the bed to cook out the pests, or even letting a goose peck gently at the hair to pluck out lice. Yes, a method referenced in later Roman texts. Oddly effective and strangely intimate, you begin to see that for ancient people, parasites were not extraordinary. They were routine, annoying, shameful, sometimes painful, but routine, just another part of the body to tend. Another humbling reminder that to live in the world was to be constantly negotiating with it, even at the smallest, most invisible scale. And so the ancient mother keeps combing. The fire dies down. The child nods off despite the tugging, and somewhere beneath the dirt floor, the next infestation waits patiently. There's a certain elegance to a smooth scalp, gleaming in the sunlight, without a single strand for a louse to cling to. But in the ancient world, shaving one's head was rarely about aesthetics alone. It was war, a daily meticulous war against crawling enemies. Let's walk through the city of Thebes, in ancient Egypt. The market is loud, the air thick with dust and incense. Women with shaved heads barter for onions. Priests with gleaming domes offer prayers to Rat. Even children, scalps bare, save for a single braided side lock, run barefoot through alleyways. But this wasn't a fashion trend. This was public health. In Egypt, the practice of shaving the head was closely linked to cleanliness and spiritual purity. Parasites, especially lice, were a constant threat, and hair was their battlefield. By removing the battlefield, the war became manageable. Priests, in particular, were required to shave every part of their body: scalp, eyebrows, armpits, even the smallest hairs on the toes. This wasn't just to appear holy, it was to remain free of filth, to avoid anything that might distract the gods, or invite crawling creatures into sacred spaces. The Greeks, who held different standards of beauty, preferred long, styled hair, but still occasionally shaved in times of plague or pestilence. To them, thick hair was a symbol of strength and status, but in hot weather or during infestation, they too reached for the blade. The Romans, ever practical, embraced the razor more enthusiastically. Wealthy Roman men often visited the tunzer, a barber who would not only style their hair, but also pluck out stray lice with fine tools and offer fragrant oil treatments. These public barber shops were more than places for grooming. They were social hubs, clinics, and quiet battlegrounds against infestation. Women, on the other hand, rarely shaved their heads outright. Their hair was considered a point of beauty, seduction, and social standing. But even they weren't immune to the pest problem. Instead, they developed clever workarounds: scented oils to drown or repel lice, vinegar rinses, and elaborate hairpins used not just for styling, but for scratching. When shaving wasn't an option, or when appearances demanded the illusion of full hair, wigs came into play. And ancient wigs were far more than costume accessories. The Egyptians mastered the art. Their wigs were often made of human hair, horsehair, or palm fibers, styled into elaborate braids or tight curls. Some were adorned with beads, gold wires, or perfumed wax cones, designed to melt slowly in the sun, releasing scent over the course of the day. But these wigs had another function. They could be removed, cleaned, and fumigated far more easily than natural hair. A woman might have 2 or 3 wigs, one for temple visits, one for casual days at the market, and one reserved for ceremonies. While she wore one, the others would be laid out in the sun or placed near burning myrrh to drive out anything that might have taken up residence. In China's Han Dynasty, hair care and grooming were also deeply ritualized. While full head shaving was rare, lice combs were common household tools, often carved from bamboo or bone and shared among family members. Hygiene was intertwined with respectability, and personal grooming rituals could take hours. Among the early Hebrews and other Semitic peoples, shaving the head was often associated with mourning or purification. In some cases, a person might shave their head after recovering from an illness, which, quite possibly, was an infestation. The Book of Leviticus outlines specific rites for cleanliness involving hair and skin, suggesting that scalp health and spiritual purity were intertwined. Yet, despite all these efforts, shaving, scraping, oiling, and scrubbing, parasites persisted. That's because even a shaved head wasn't a guarantee of peace. The scalp could still be bitten. The skin could still host mites. The bedding, clothing, and furniture around a person might remain infested, undoing all the care taken with the body itself. Still, the ritual mattered. It gave people control, however fleeting, over their own discomfort. Shaving became a mourning offering. Oiling the skin became a protective charm. Scrubbing with coarse salt or crushed herbs became a moment of defense, a sacred pause. In some African cultures, certain hairstyles were believed to repel insects: tight braids, oiled coils, scalp adornments with aromatic plant resin. Even style could be a strategy. And across the world, a certain belief took root that how you wore your hair said something about your health, your hygiene, and your soul. A clean head was a clean spirit. A parasite-free scalp was a sign of favor, earthly or divine. And so, in villages and palaces, shrines and mud huts, ancient people continued this daily war, with blades, with oils, with fire and patience. Because the enemy was small, but relentless. And there's something quietly noble about facing such a battle every single morning. Night in ancient Greece was not the peaceful retreat we might imagine. The sun would set behind stone temples and olive trees, and families would retreat into their modest homes, thick-walled, cool, quiet. Oil lamps flickered, wine was poured, stories were told, and beneath it all, something else stirred. Not spirits, not gods, bedbugs, tiny, reddish-brown, and relentless. They thrived in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the creases of woven mats, and between the bricks of sleeping chambers. In ancient Athens and beyond, bedbugs were as common as dust, and no one, not philosophers, not fishmongers, not poets, was safe from their midnight feasts. But the Greeks, ever inventive, had rituals. Some were practical, others were absurd, all were desperate. Let's start with the practical: drying beds in the sun. Greek homes often had flat rooftops or courtyards where bedding could be laid out for hours. The heat drove out moisture, and with luck, the insects hiding deep inside. Some families even beat their mattresses with sticks, believing the rhythmic pounding would drive bedbugs from their hiding places. The next step was to cleanse the space. The burning sulfur was common, dangerous and acrid, yes, but believed to be highly effective. The fumes were thought to kill both bugs and spirits alike. Families would burn sulfur at dusk, close the doors, and return only in the morning. Of course, the smell was terrible, but the promise of an itch-free sleep was worth it. Then came the oddities. One remedy involved placing a bowl of blood under the bed to distract the insects. The theory? If you offered them a closer target, they might spare you. Another suggested smearing onion paste around the bed frame to repel them, though this had the added effect of making the bedroom smell like a cook's apron. There was also a peculiar superstition involving the first bedbug ever caught in a new home. According to some texts, if you captured a bedbug on your first night and crushed it while chanting a curse, it would ward off future infestations. The logic wasn't scientific, it was psychological, a small gesture of control against a problem that felt otherwise overwhelming. Some families turned to amulets. Tiny bags of herbs, lavender, thyme, wormwood were hung above beds or tucked into pillows. Whether or not they repelled insects, they offered a sense of calm, and sometimes that was all you needed to fall asleep. The scent of something clean, something believed to help. For those who could afford it, bed construction itself became a matter of parasite defense. The wealthy slept on high wooden platforms, elevated above the floor, with thick linen sheets and tightly woven wool. The poor slept closer to the ground, on straw or mats, easy access for crawling things. This distinction became social, as well as physical. Elevated sleeping wasn't just comfort, it was protection. Greek physicians wrote of bites and rashes, recommending soothing salves made from olive oil, crushed barley, and mint. Others insisted on nightly foot baths to cool the blood, believing it might make one less tasty to bugs. Even the playwright Aristophanes joked about bedbugs in his comedies, their persistence, their audacity, their ability to ruin even the sweetest romantic tryst. Everyone knew, everyone suffered, so everyone laughed, softly, bitterly, sleeplessly. In temple cities, such as Delphi or Ephesus, priests sometimes offered prayers or symbolic sacrifices for the biting of invisible mouths. In some regions, bedbugs were lumped in with spiritual attackers, unseen forces that invaded the home. Some believed that keeping a sacred text or small idol beneath the bed would help. Others believed that bathing in seawater during the full moon would cleanse one of the crawling curse. One particularly curious ritual involved inviting the bedbugs into a decoy space, a spare blanket rolled and left on the floor, sprinkled with sweet wine. The hope was that the insects would be drawn to the moisture and sugar, sparing the actual bedding. Whether it worked or not is debatable, but the act itself, a nightly offering, a kind of barter, shows how intimately people engaged with their tormentors. It wasn't extermination, it was negotiation. The Greeks were not alone in this. Similar tactics appear in Roman, Persian, and Indian texts, but the Greeks gave the battle a particularly philosophical flair. Parasites, they believed, were a reminder of the limits of pleasure. Even in the most elegant homes, with soft linens and scented oils, a creature the size of a sesame seed could bring ruin. And so each night, after the lamps were snuffed and sandals removed, families lay down, not in peace, but in uneasy silence. And when the bites came, they did not always scream or swat. Sometimes, they simply rolled over, whispered a prayer to Hypnos, and tried to dream of a world without itching. In a world without soap as we know it, without bottles lined on tiled shelves, without warm showers or silky lathers, cleanliness had to come from the earth itself. And so it did. Ash, clay, sand, mud, crushed seeds, burnt herbs. These were the shampoos of the ancient world, scrubs and pastes pulled from the dirt to battle what the body could not ignore, lice, mites, and skin-feeding parasites. Let us begin beneath the hanging gardens of Babylon, where noble women and servants alike stood beside clay jars of oil and ash water. Here, hygiene wasn't a daily indulgence. It was a ritual, a protection, a soft rebellion against what always returned. Ash, especially from burnt barley or palm husk, was mixed with water to create a gritty paste. It was massaged into the scalp, left to sit, then rinsed in cool river water. This wasn't for shine or fragrance, though it helped with both. In Mesopotamia, it was applied to both hair and body partially to remove oil and dirt, but also because it pulled at the skin, tightening it, stripping it of whatever clung too closely. Lice, they believed, disliked the sensation and often clung to the clay instead of the scalp, making them easier to comb out once dried. In India, Multani mitti, fuller's earth, was prized for its cooling properties. It was mixed with neem leaves, turmeric or sandalwood powder, and spread over the skin like a salve. Neem, in particular, was a botanical blessing, its bitter oils a natural insect repellent, known even today for its effectiveness against lice and mites. Egyptians combined red clay from the Nile with crushed herbs, often mint, basil, or myrrh. This mixture, left in the sun until warm, was massaged into the scalp with wooden sticks. The heat was thought to stir the insects, forcing them to the surface where they could be pinched or combed out. Across sub-Saharan Africa, a paste made of fine ash and palm oil was rubbed onto the scalp to kill lice and soothe inflammation. Thixamanalka. In some regions, this mixture was also applied to infant heads as both protection and purification, especially before public ceremonies or naming rituals. Among the ancient Chinese, rice water mixed with wood ash was used to rinse the hair. Not only did this combination cleanse, but the starchy water left a soft sheen behind. In certain dynasties, it became common for women to grow their hair long and silky, not because lice were absent, but because they had discovered routines that kept them at bay most of the time. These treatments weren't always comfortable. Clay dried tight on the skin. Ash could cause burning if misused. Some mixtures smelled foul, like mold or smoke or bitterness, but they offered something deeper than fragrance. They offered hope. A moment, an hour, a night, when one might go to bed feeling clean, feeling victorious, feeling perhaps untouched. Even in ancient Europe, peasants used what they could: soapwort, a flowering plant that, when crushed in water, created a light foam. Not quite soap, but close enough. In cold months, when rivers froze, they would heat buckets of water over the hearth and mix in ash from the fire. It was gritty, it was basic, but it worked, in its way. Still, the relief was temporary. Lice eggs, called nits, clung tightly to hair shafts. Mites burrowed into folds of skin. Fleas lived not just on the body, but in the cracks of every wooden surface nearby. One could wash, one could scrape. One could mix clay with every sweet-smelling herb in the land, but the bugs came back. And so the ritual wasn't about eradication, it was about resistance, about drawing a line, however thin, between your body and the world. Washing became an act of worship, not to a god above, but to the body itself, to the fragile temple that bore the burden of every parasite, every bite, every unseen invader. There's something deeply human in that image. A young girl kneeling by a stream, smearing her hair with cold gray clay, her fingers stained, her breath fogging in the morning air, not because she wants to look pretty, but because she's tired of scratching, because her sleep has been thin, because her mother taught her this, because it helped once. The water rushes, the clay dries, the bugs wait, but she feels stronger, cleaner, calmer, and sometimes that was enough. In every age, there have been things one simply did not do in public. You did not speak too loudly in the presence of nobles. You did not eat with your left hand in certain cultures. And, perhaps most universally, you did not scratch, at least not conspicuously. To scratch too often was to reveal something shameful, not just discomfort, but dirtiness, neglect, even poverty. Parasites in ancient societies weren't just pests. They were a mark of your station, a symbol of your circumstances, a sign, whether fairly or not, that you lived closer to the filth of the world. And so, an entire etiquette evolved around the most human of reactions, the itch. Imagine for a moment a Roman banquet, long wooden tables, piled with roasted meats, olives, sweetened wines. Senators in fine togas recline on silk-covered couches, discussing politics and poetry. But should one guest pause to dig at his scalp or tug at the collar of his tunic too forcefully, eyes would narrow. No one would say anything aloud, of course. That would be crude, but glances would be exchanged. Quiet judgments made. Is he ill? Unwashed? Did his slaves fail to boil his linens? Even among the upper classes, who were by no means immune to lice or mites, scratching was performed with discretion, A slow rub of the temple, a gentle tug at the beard, a yawn that allowed a quick dig at the ribs. Anything to hide the truth that the itch never really left. In temples across the Near East, priests were expected to maintain an image of absolute purity. Their garments were white, their bodies shaven, their fingers oiled, and their public composure serene. But beneath that stillness, many of them itched. Parasites didn't care about your rituals. They didn't care that you'd fasted for 3 days or prayed at sunrise. They nestled in your tunic. They waited in the floor mats. And still, to scratch would have been a kind of heresy, a confession of bodily weakness in the very house of the divine. Among the poor, the situation was reversed. Itching was a fact of life, not a scandal. Children scratched openly. Farmers wiped sweat from their brows with dirt-caked fingers, then scratched their arms without shame. A baker with flour on his hands might pause to itch his leg, leaving a ghostly smear of white behind. No one judged them for it. They were expected to live among the lice, the fleas, the mites, but even so, shame still lingered. In markets and crowded streets, poor women pulled their shawls tight when scratching. Children were scolded for doing it too visibly. In some towns, local healers offered small tokens, herb pouches, polished amulets, not necessarily because they worked, but because they gave the illusion of care. At least she's trying, neighbors might say. At least she's not ignoring the infestation. Parasites became a symbol, not just of discomfort, but of neglect. To be visibly crawling was to be visibly forgotten by society, by the gods, by one's own household. In medieval Europe, this dynamic became particularly stark. Monks, often cleaner than nobles due to strict bathing rules, looked down on lords who reeked of perfume and rot. Noble women in lace sleeves and elaborate wigs hid colonies of lice beneath powder and pomade, while village midwives scrubbed themselves raw with lye soap and cold stream water. And still, if the midwife scratched her neck in front of the bishop's assistant, she might be shunned. The irony was bitter. The rich had parasites. They simply hid them better. They masked the odor. They used scented oils. They kept linen sheets and employed servants to launder them. But behind all the layers, beneath silk and velvet, were the same old bites, the same swollen welts, the same quiet, maddening crawl. In the Ottoman court, physicians recorded cases of royal family members infested with invisible insects of the scalp, often treated with vinegar compresses and perfumed balms. And yet, court etiquette demanded stillness, elegance, poise. A princess who scratched too often might be rumored to carry a curse. A vizier who flicked a flea mid-conversation could lose face or worse. In ancient Japan, where grooming was ritualized to an art, lice were sometimes collected during daily combing and burned with incense. But still, to scratch in front of one's master was considered deeply disrespectful. Servants often practiced the art of invisible suffering, learning to endure itching without flinching. And yet, scratching still happened. At night, when the candles were snuffed and no eyes were watching, people gave in, behind curtains, beneath blankets, in the shadows of stairwells and storerooms. Fingers raked across skin with exhausted relief. Sometimes it bled, sometimes it scarred, but it was human. This dichotomy between hiding the itch and surrendering to it tells us so much about how parasites shaped not just the body, but society itself. They reminded people of their fragility. They blurred the lines between rich and poor, and they introduced a silent etiquette that to appear unbothered was almost as important as being clean. So next time you read of a queen gracefully reclining, or a scribe composing hymns in perfect serenity, pause for a moment. Imagine them scratching, just once, when no one was looking. They say a home without animals was a home without warmth. No barking in the night, no lowing of cattle, no flick of a cat's tail by the hearth. But in the ancient world, animals brought more than companionship, more than milk, meat, or protection. They brought fleas, and sometimes worse. In rural Mesopotamia, the goat was everything. It gave milk, it carried goods, It fertilized fields, but it also carried lice. Its fur, warm and coarse, became a haven for parasites, some of which easily leapt from fur to skin, especially when animals slept inside the home, as they often did during colder months. In Egypt, cats were sacred, beloved, pampered, but even the sleekest temple feline could carry fleas from room to room, from market stalls to priestly chambers. One scratch behind the ears, one nuzzle against a bare ankle, and the flea had found its next meal. Ancient households were not the sterile, divided spaces we know today. Animals and humans shared everything: air, water, bedding, even body heat. In Roman villas, dogs often slept beside children, curled at their feet in winter. Pigs rooted under kitchen tables. Birds fluttered along beams. And rats, though uninvited, were ever present, scavenging crumbs and nesting in thatched roofs. Each of these creatures brought with them invisible passengers. The rat flea, in particular, would go on to play a deadly role in history. But long before the Great Plagues, it was simply one of many irritants, something that made your skin prickle, your rest uneasy. In medieval Europe, barn animals slept just feet away from their owners, sometimes in the same room, sometimes separated by nothing more than a wooden rail. Children would pet the cows goodnight. Shepherds would tuck in beside their dogs. And in that closeness, in that shared breath and warmth, parasites passed effortlessly from hide to skin, from hoof to heel. There were even beliefs that certain animals made people itchier. Some said that sleeping beside a pig guaranteed skin rashes. Others believed that the scratchiness of a cow's fur could rub off onto humans, spiritually or physically. A few medieval texts caution against letting chickens roost too close to infants, not because of noise, but because of mites. And it wasn't just domestic animals. Wild animals, bats, rodents, stray dogs, slipped through ancient cities like shadows. In densely populated areas, like Athens or Jerusalem, it was common to see lean cats slinking along alleyways, rats scurrying under market stalls, and birds nesting under rooftops. Each movement left behind traces, droppings, fur, eggs, parasites. Some cultures took protective measures. In parts of ancient China, it was common to dust living spaces with dried citrus peel or pungent herbs, hoping to repel insects. In rural African communities, families might burn dung or dried grass at dusk, letting the smoke drive out both pests and the animals that carried them. In the Americas, among the Maya, certain homes were built with ventilation gaps, not just for airflow, but to discourage infestation from both human and animal parasites. Still, dogs were family. Chickens lived under floors. There was no true barrier, and so people adapted. They combed themselves after caring for animals. They boiled clothes after mucking stalls. They chewed bitter herbs before bed. And when the itching came anyway, they blamed the goat, or the weather, or themselves. Parasites, in this way, were not just personal burdens. They were communal, passed from animal to human and back again. A shared discomfort that knit village life together. There's something almost poetic about that. A child scratching her arm, not knowing whether it was from her straw bed, her wool tunic, or the puppy she cradled in the afternoon. A mother sighing at yet another welt, another rash, another ruined night of sleep, but still pulling the lamb inside when the wind turned cold. Because the truth is, they needed each other, and that closeness, as inconvenient and itchy as it sometimes was also love. Even today, pet owners still battle fleas, still vacuum obsessively, still comb through fur with tweezers and sighs. Not much has changed. We still itch. We still love. We still choose company over comfort, because being human has never been a parasite-free experience. And perhaps, in the end, that's what makes us resilient. Not that we avoid the crawl, but that we bear it. For the warmth of a cat on our chest, a dog by our door, a goat at our side in the storm. So ends the daily crawl of ancient life. Scratching, shaving, boiling, bargaining, and bathing. Parasites weren't just intruders. They were part of the rhythm, part of the labor, part of the sleep. In the ancient world, people didn't just suffer. They searched for meaning in the suffering. When a man doubled over with gut pain, when a child wasted away despite eating, when blood appeared where it should not, they didn't call it infection. They called it judgment, or possession, or punishment from forces that could not be seen. Because before microscopes and biology, there were stories, and every sickness had one. In Egypt, they told tales of river demons, spirits that clung to the ankles of those who walked into the Nile, slipping inside like whispers. The waters were holy. The Nile was life, but it was also treacherous. Its currents hid not only crocodiles and sharp stones, but something more mysterious, something internal. We now know that schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection caused by tiny flukes, plagued ancient Egyptians in staggering numbers. The parasite entered through the skin, often while bathing or washing clothes in slow-moving water. Once inside the body, it traveled through the bloodstream, settled in the liver or bladder, and began its quiet torment, causing swelling, pain, and blood in the urine. But the ancients didn't call it that. They called it the curse of the river. In Edfu and Aswan, young boys would come home feverish, their bellies distended. Elders would nod solemnly. He has angered the water, they might say. He didn't leave the offering. He entered unblessed. Mothers would burn incense. Fathers would whisper prayers. And the child would be wrapped in linen, anointed with oils, fed warm herbal broth, and left to rest under the hopeful eyes of the gods. The god Heka, often associated with magic and healing, was invoked in these cases. Priests would recite long incantations over sacred stones, pressing them against the body while muttering pleas for internal demons to release their grip. Sometimes they would chant the names of ancient enemies, believing the worm to be not a creature, but a curse with a name. Elsewhere in the region, people turned to the goddess Isis, praying for mercy. She was both a mother and a healer, a protector of children and the afflicted. Small amulets of Isis nursing her son Horus were placed beneath beds or tied to belts near the abdomen, believed to protect against creatures that crawl beneath. Some of the treatments were surprisingly aligned with modern logic: garlic, dates soaked in vinegar, ground myrrh. These had mild antiparasitic properties, but others were more symbolic. A child might be told to swallow 7 pebbles from the riverbank, one for each day of the illness, while a curse was chanted in reverse, or to drink from a clay bowl that had been shattered and mended again, signifying the mending of the body. For adults, especially men who worked in irrigation or fishing, the infection was so common that entire communities built rituals around its symptoms. Blood in the urine became known as the red stream, and was sometimes interpreted not as illness, but as a mark of spiritual imbalance. In temples, scribes documented dreams in which worms appeared, wrapped around the legs or coiled in the stomach. These were taken seriously, signs that the sufferer was being warned, or perhaps purified by suffering. But there was also shame. To admit one had been taken by the water was to admit weakness, poor hygiene, spiritual impurity. Kabul hid their symptoms when they could. They limped quietly. They bled discreetly. They prayed in silence and scratched symbols on the inside of their clothing. And all the while, the parasites fed. It is sobering to think that for centuries, these tiny invaders shaped not only bodies, but beliefs. They turned rivers into sacred battlegrounds. They turned symptoms into omens. They turned medicine into ritual, and ritual into survival. Because when you don't know what's killing you, you give it a name. You give it a face. You give it power, so you can beg it to go away. Even now, when we know the name schistosoma, it doesn't erase the poetry of what came before. The child standing at the Nile's edge, offering a fig to the current. The priest, laying his hands on a bloated belly, calling upon Heka to chase out the demon. The mother whispering a lullaby to her fevered son, singing not of worms but of gods. Because to them, the enemy was never small. It was ancient. It was sacred. It was part of life. And in naming it, they found a strange kind of peace. In the low, sun-baked lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where writing was first carved into clay and laws were measured in grain, illness had a language all its own. The Mesopotamians, Babylonians, Sumerians, Akkadians were some of the earliest people to formalize medicine. They wrote prescriptions, they studied symptoms, they cataloged treatments. But parasites? Parasites were not just illness. They were spirits, unclean, invisible, persistent spirits. And if your stomach churned, if your body betrayed you with bloating, fever, or frequent painful trips to the pit latrine, you were said to be afflicted with a hand of the ghost. The symptoms of what we now recognize as roundworm, tapeworm, or giardiasis were interpreted not as natural infections, but as the direct result of spiritual intrusion. Something or someone had entered the body, not through sin, perhaps, but through vulnerability, through a moment of weakness or exposure, through a curse. In clay cuneiform tablets from the city of Nineveh, we find detailed rituals for cleansing the bowels. These weren't simple dietary changes. They were ceremonial events. A sufferer would enter a temple compound, carrying an offering, often something symbolic of nourishment, a loaf of barley bread, a small dish of oil, a live goat, or a jar of fermented beer. The offering wasn't always to a god directly. It might be to the demon afflicting the body, in hopes that it would leave peacefully if appeased. And then came the ritual washing. In large public baths, more spiritual than sanitary, the sufferer would be washed with water infused with herbs, juniper, thyme, and sweet flag. The priest, sometimes called an ashipu or healer scribe, would recite incantations during the bath, naming the organs, commanding the spirit to release them. One common incantation, translated from Akkadian, reads, "You who dwell in the liver like shadow, you who feast on the bread of my innards, go now into the clay jar, go now into the goat, go now and trouble me no more." After bathing, the person would be fed a mixture of honey, garlic, and tashritu, a resin-based paste believed to sweeten the bowels and sour the appetite of the demon. Whether this mixture had actual antiparasitic effects or not, it offered something more essential: hope, because in Mesopotamian medicine, the body and soul were not separate. Pain in the gut meant something was wrong in the cosmos. An infestation in the intestines was an imbalance in your relationship to the gods or to the dead. For this reason, ancestors were often involved in healing rituals. If a child was sick with stomach pain, a clay figurine might be made in the likeness of a dead grandparent and placed beside the bed. The belief was that the ancestor could watch over the digestion and protect against further torment. In some cases, the afflicted person would create a clay model of themselves, a small figure, intentionally flawed, with a swollen belly or crooked limbs. This model was taken to the edge of the city, buried under a palm tree, and left as a symbolic decoy, an invitation for the illness to leave the real body and inhabit the false one instead. If symptoms improved, the family might return weeks later to burn incense at the site, giving thanks to the desert spirits for their mercy. These healing practices were often performed at night, when spirits were believed to be more active, but also more willing to listen. In candlelit temple chambers, incense curling through the dark, people prayed not just for healing, but for release from bloating, release from shame, release from the gnawing sense that something wrong lived inside. Interestingly, Mesopotamian texts also mention bowel-binding spells, designed not to cure, but to cause illness in enemies. These spells called upon spirits to inhabit the stomach, twist the intestines, and deny the victim rest. It was a reminder that the same invisible powers could be protectors or punishers. And so people became cautious. They offered bread, not just to the gods, but to the pest spirits themselves. They fasted. They anointed their navels with oil. They chanted softly while stirring their porridge. They negotiated with their suffering, because they believed illness was not just something that happened to you. It was something you lived with, something you reasoned with, something you could, with luck and ritual, persuade to go away. And if it did, if the pain eased, the belly softened, the appetite returned, you didn't just thank the gods, you thanked the worms too for letting go. There is something unsettling about the leech. It moves without legs, it bites without teeth, it drinks without mercy. And yet for thousands of years, it was not just accepted, it was welcomed, because when the body was unwell, when the humors were wrong, or the gods displeased, the leech became a sacred intermediary, both punishment and cure, pain and promise. Let us begin in India, where the ancient science of Ayurveda first categorized the body, not as a battleground, but as a landscape, one governed by energies, fluids, and unseen forces. According to Ayurvedic texts, like the Sushruta Samhita, disease was often caused by an imbalance in the doshas Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. When one dosha grew excessive, it had to be reduced. One way to do that, bloodletting, and one gentle, precise, and strangely dignified method of bloodletting was through leech therapy, or Jalaukavacharana, but not just any leech. Only specific leeches, dark, glossy, and found in clean, slow-moving water, were chosen for this work. They were first trained by being kept in milk or turmeric-infused water to cleanse their bodies. Then, when needed, they were applied to the skin of the patient, often near inflamed joints, swollen veins, or rashes believed to be caused by bad blood. The sensation? Slight pressure, a tug, a slow drawing out. And then, relief. To the ancient Indian healer, this was more than a medical act. It was spiritual sanitation, an invitation to the leech to carry away not only illness, but imbalance, impurity, and karmic weight. The leech became both tool and priest, absorbing the sins of the flesh. Prayers were sometimes whispered during the process. Offerings of ghee or grains might be made afterward, thanking the forces that allowed such healing to occur. But for the patient, it was a strange relationship, to be fed upon, to be punctured, and yet to feel better. It blurred the line between harm and healing. Across the continent, in ancient Greece, the leech played a different, though similarly curious role. Here, medicine was shaped by humorism, the belief that the body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness meant one was in excess. Blood, being the most volatile, was often blamed. Too angry? Too feverish? Too swollen or sluggish? The cure was to let blood, and while knives and cups were commonly used, leeches offered a slower, subtler alternative. Greek physicians, especially those following the teachings of Hippocrates and later Galen, used leeches to draw blood from sensitive areas around the temples for headaches, near the belly for digestive troubles, or even inside the mouth to treat sore throats. Some even believed that leeches could detect where the imbalance lay, that they would attach only to areas of sickness. When a leech refused to bite, it was seen as an omen. Either the patient was not ill or beyond help. In this sense, the leech was almost an oracle. Its behavior was read like a sign. Did it drink deeply? Good. The sickness was leaving. Did it fall off too quickly? Bad. The illness was resisting. Did it not attach at all? Terrible. The spirit had already claimed the body. And while most physicians used leeches with a steady hand and clinical detachment, some temples, especially those devoted to Asclepius, god of healing, treated them with reverence. A few ancient Greek healing sanctuaries kept special water basins where holy leeches lived. Sick pilgrims might bathe nearby, hoping the leeches would find them worthy. The experience was not always pleasant. People fainted, people screamed, people bled too much, but others swore they walked away lighter, less inflamed, more balanced. Some even claimed to see visions during the feeding, a black serpent, the symbol of Asclepius, coiling out of their body as the leech drank. Of course, not all views of leeches were so reverent. In both India and Greece, there were warnings. Leeches could be cursed, poisoned, used in black magic. A vengeful person might whisper a name into a leech's jar before releasing it in a bathhouse, believing the parasite would now choose its target. Others believed that if a leech fed on someone too sick, it could become tainted and pass that sickness to the next person. Still, despite these fears, the practice endured for centuries, even into the medieval period. And astonishingly, even into the 19th century, leeches remained a fixture of medicine. They were bred, sold, taxed, and transported in damp linen sacks across entire empires. Some kings had personal leechers. Some monasteries kept jars of them in the apothecary. Even today, modern medicine uses leeches in reconstructive surgery, because nature, for all its horror, often knows what it's doing. But perhaps the strangest truth of all, the leech didn't ask for any of this. It was just being what it was. And yet, for the sick and the suffering, it became something greater, an act of surrender, a ritual of trust, a letting go of what ailed the body, inch by inch, through the patient pull of a creature that neither judged nor cured, but simply fed and left you, somehow, a little lighter. In the stillness of the night, when the fire and the hearth had burned low and the house had quieted, there was one fear that stirred both peasants and priests alike. The belly. Not just hunger, but what lived within it. Ancient people knew, intuitively, that something happened in the darkness of the gut. Something strange, mysterious, and beyond their control. It gurgled, it cramped, it swelled, it bled, it expelled, and sometimes it writhed. In Babylonian belief, illness was never just a physical flaw. It was a sign that a spirit or shedu had entered the body. These demons were not always malicious in the way we might imagine today. Some were clumsy, others vengeful, and a few simply hungry. One such demon, feared for centuries, was Alu, a spirit of disorder and restlessness. While not limited to the belly, Alu was thought to cause nocturnal torment, stomach twisting, choking in the night, and insomnia paired with feverish trembling. If a person awoke groaning, clutching their abdomen, and sweating in the dark, it was said that Alu had entered through their mouth while they slept and taken residence in the bowels. Healers, called Ashipu, would respond with ritual cleansing. A clay figurine of the afflicted person might be molded with exaggerated swollen features, particularly the stomach, and then symbolically opened or broken as the healer recited incantations designed to expel the demon through sympathetic magic. Sometimes, special foods were given: onions soaked in vinegar, sour beer, flat cakes of barley infused with bitter herbs, not to feed the person, but to drive the intruder out, make the belly inhospitable, one tablet reads, so the invader finds no home. These weren't just metaphors. Modern scholars believe many of these descriptions reflect the symptoms of intestinal parasites, tapeworms, pinworms, and liver flukes that caused swelling, wasting, itching, and erratic behavior when left untreated. And yet, the people of Babylon didn't blame the worm. They blamed the invitation. A moment of spiritual weakness, a lapse in ritual, a forgotten offering. Among ancient Jewish communities, a different but equally rich tradition developed. While the Torah contains general laws on cleanliness, ritual purity, and dietary discipline, post-biblical texts like the Talmud dive deeper into bodily affliction, including, curiously, the idea that the gut could be inhabited by living creatures that had spiritual consequences. One such idea is found in Tractate Gittin, where it's written that a person who neglects certain blessings might be punished with a wasting disease of the bowels. Commentators across generations debated what this meant, but some interpreted it literally, believing the body could become home to an impure force or entity, especially through poor hygiene or spiritual negligence. Later texts describe the tolat, a term meaning worm, but sometimes symbolizing deeper moral or physical rot. The tolat was said to dwell in those who hoarded wealth or failed to give charity, gnawing away from the inside, unseen by others. The idea that wrongdoing could manifest as infestation was a sobering one, but there was also mercy in the belief system. The Book of Psalms is filled with pleas for healing that seem to understand suffering, not as punishment, but as a moment of divine closeness. My wounds fester and are loathsome because of my foolishness. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. In the Kabbalistic tradition that followed, illness of the stomach was sometimes seen as an imbalance between divine energies, chesed, mercy, and gevura, judgment. A parasitic affliction, then, might not be caused by a literal demon, but by a disruption in the spiritual harmony that allowed the body to function. Even so, folk remedies abounded. Garlic mashed with salt, wine boiled with figs, ashes from burnt prayer scrolls mixed into barley water. One particularly strange custom involved whispering a prayer into a gourd, then placing the gourd beside the bed so the spirit of the worm could be drawn into it overnight. Whether this worked or not is beside the point. It gave shape to suffering. It gave people something to do when helpless. It allowed them to imagine the enemy, not as a failure of their body, but as a force they could reason with, bribe, cast out, or even forgive. What ties these cultures together, Babylonian and Jewish, is not just fear of the belly's mystery, but the belief that suffering had a personality. Parasites weren't random. They had moods, motives, rules. They weren't treated with force, but with strategy, with words, prayers, sympathy, even ritual appeasement. Because if something entered the body, it could be asked, gently, firmly, hopefully, to leave, not as a command, but as a negotiation. And in that negotiation, there was dignity, because to name your demon is to reclaim your power, to see your suffering as a visitor, not your identity, is a kind of healing all its own. When ancient people felt helpless, when their skin prickled, when their bellies churned, when the body betrayed them in ways they couldn't see, they turned to something both ancient and deeply human, magic. Because when herbs failed, when the priest's prayers fell short, when the pain persisted, it helped to believe there was something you could wear, whisper, or hide under your pillow that might just protect you. Parasites were invisible intruders, too small to see, too slippery to catch. But people believed they could be distracted, tricked, repelled, or bound, and so they made amulets. In ancient Mesopotamia, small clay plaques were inscribed with protective cuneiform symbols, sometimes shaped like the human body, other times like tiny doors. These were placed at the entrances to homes, bedrooms, or latrines. The idea was that if a spirit or illness came looking for a body to inhabit, it would see the symbol and pass by. More personal versions were worn on the body. One common design was a thin, disc-shaped amulet bearing the name of a protective deity, often Ninisina, the Sumerian goddess of healing, or Gula, the dog-headed goddess associated with medical magic. Some tablets even describe amulets that burn the bellies of worms, meant to weaken internal parasites through divine heat. These were often made of lapis lazuli, carnelian, or baked clay, and tied with dyed wool string around the neck, waist, or wrist. It was not unusual for sick children to wear 3 or 4 at once, each inscribed by a different healer. In ancient Egypt, amulets took more literal forms. One popular charm was the tayet, the knot of Isis, associated with healing and protection of the womb and bowels. Made from red jasper or hematite, it was placed on the chest or abdomen of the afflicted. But perhaps more striking were the serpent-shaped amulets, often coiled in loops. The Egyptians believed that many internal illnesses were caused by invisible snakes, creatures that slithered through the organs, unseen but felt. By wearing a serpent charm, the wearer was aligning themselves with the divine form of the snake, controlled, sacred, and strong, so the wild inner snakes might be subdued. Sometimes, amulets were not worn at all, but swallowed. Small scrolls, inscribed with spells and rolled tightly into wax or dough, were occasionally consumed with wine or honey. These were called edible spells, the idea being that if the illness lived in the gut, the spell must meet it there. The Greeks and Romans had their own arsenal. Tiny lead tablets called defixiones were etched with protective charms and buried beneath thresholds or under pillows. These were more often used for curses, but protective versions existed too, especially in rural households. One common phrase, scratched in Latin, reads, "Rauner, let the thing that crawls in me crawl away. Let it find no warmth, no place to feed." Worn charms also featured engraved eyes to deflect the evil eye. Coiled snakes were the Greek word hygeia, health personified. In rural Italy, mothers would whisper a charm into their child's ear after feeding, then tie a red thread around the ankle to keep stomach spirits from entering during sleep. In Jewish tradition, protective amulets were rooted in both scripture and mystical symbolism. Small parchments inscribed with verses from Psalms, Exodus, or Deuteronomy were sewn into pouches and worn over the chest or lower back, regions associated with internal pain. Some included divine names, written in rearranged sequences, believed to confuse spiritual attackers. One amulet, attributed to medieval Jewish communities, bore this instruction: to be free from the worm, write the name of Raphael, the angel of healing, 7 times, with each letter crowned, wrap in lambskin, and bind to the navel. There were also spoken charms, often said softly at night, beside the fire or over a sickbed. One example, translated from Aramaic: "Worm of the night, I do not feed you. Go to the desert where no water waits." It wasn't about biology, it was about narrative, giving the illness a path, a story, a place to go. Some cultures combine sound with protection. In parts of North Africa and the Levant, women would chant repetitive syllables while circling the sick child's bed, clapping or drumming slowly. Burgezaumbek gets. These sounds weren't random. They were patterns believed to confuse or drive away the parasite spirit. Other communities in sub-Saharan Africa used masks and rattles during healing ceremonies, not to scare the sick, but to disorient the invisible force believed to cause the illness. In this worldview, parasites were not always malicious. They were just lost, and sometimes they needed to be guided home. Across these cultures and continents, the message was the same. When you cannot see your enemy, when it moves beneath the skin, when it drinks your strength slowly and says nothing, you fight with symbols, with string, with prayer, with copper and carnelian, with stories, and maybe with just enough belief to give your suffering a name, because once it has a name, you can ask it to leave. Long before syringes and pills, long before microscopes revealed the hidden world of pathogens, healing often arrived on horseback, cloaked in robes, or barefoot in the dust. It came in the form of a saint, a human, yes, but also something more, a chosen one, a vessel, a holy interruption to the grinding machinery of everyday suffering. And when the belly swelled, when the skin erupted in sores, when the body crawled with invisible tormentors that no herb or oil could banish, people turned to stories, and the stories turned to saints. One of the most beloved and oddly specific figures in this healing tradition was Saint Roch, also called San Rocco, a Christian saint widely venerated in the Middle Ages, though best known for interceding during plagues. Saint Roch was also invoked in cases of swellings, boils, and mysterious skin afflictions, which, looking back, were often the visible symptoms of internal infections, parasites, or lymphatic reactions. According to legend, Roch was born to a wealthy French family in the 14th century, gave up his inheritance, and traveled across Europe healing plague victims. He prayed over swollen limbs. He offered no medicines, only blessings, presence, and a strange radiant calm. Then, one day, he fell ill himself. His body bloated, his legs erupted in sores. He was cast out, feared to be contagious. Alone and trembling, he wandered into the woods. And here's where the story turns. A dog began to visit him daily, bringing bread in its mouth. Roch, feverish and praying, accepted the bread and waited for death. But instead, the boils began to recede. The swelling eased. Light went, and within days he rose from the ground, healed, grateful, and transformed. Whether the disease was parasitic, bacterial, or something else entirely, we may never know. But to the people who told his story, that didn't matter. What mattered was the idea that even the worst suffering, raw, oozing, shameful, could be seen by heaven. That someone could look at you, even when you were disgusting, and love you back into life. Saint Roch was not alone. In Eastern Orthodox traditions, Saint Tryphon was known as a healer of livestock and humans alike, particularly against parasites of the stomach and skin. Farmers would pray to him when animals refused to eat, or when they showed signs of infestation. He was called upon with candles, small coins, and sometimes soil sprinkled from the church doorstep into animal feed. In some regions, icons of Saint Tryphon were pressed to the bellies of the sick, human or beast, with the belief that the parasite, seeing the saint's image, would flee in terror. In Irish and Scottish traditions, tales circulated of unnamed hermit saints who healed by touch alone. These figures lived in caves or huts near springs and spoke little. People would bring sick children, bloated animals, or weeping wounds to them. No questions were asked. The saint would touch the belly, say a single word, perhaps offer a sip of spring water, and the illness would pass. In many of these stories, the healing wasn't immediate, but humble, subtle, quiet, a softening of pain, a return of appetite, a night without itching, enough to be remembered, enough to become legend. Sometimes, the healing wasn't physical. In many medieval monasteries, monks would record the testimonies of pilgrims who visited the tombs of saints believed to offer healing even in death. St. Kieran, these included St. Cuthbert, St. Benedict, and St. Hildegard, among others. A man who had been suffering for years with chronic belly pain, likely caused by parasites or ulcers, might sleep near the saint's bones, wake with a warm sensation in his gut, and declare himself cured. Whether the miracle was real or imagined, did it matter? The suffering eased. That was enough. And even those who weren't saints became saint-like through care. In small villages across Europe, grannies and herbalists with no official title acted as living saints for their communities. They spoke softly, touched foreheads, rubbed bellies with lavender oil, whispered prayers into hot compresses, sang over infusions of yarrow and chamomile. They didn't claim divinity, but when someone improved, they were quietly revered, because healing, in the end, wasn't always about the parasite. Sometimes it was about being seen, being touched, being spoken to kindly in a moment of terror, and knowing, deep down, that someone believed you could get better, even when you didn't. Saints didn't cure everyone, but they gave people a name to whisper in the dark. They gave the suffering a story to enter, and maybe to leave through. And in that story, the worms grew smaller. The boils became symbols. The belly became sacred again, not a curse, not a battleground, but a place where grace might someday return. They named the worms. They painted the demons. They whispered to the invaders, because sometimes healing wasn't about driving the parasite out. If belief was a balm, cure was a gamble. Because once you believed something lived inside you, something that didn't belong, what came next was action. And in the ancient world, action often meant swallowing something you hoped wouldn't kill you first. Let's begin, not with saints or spirits, but with the pantry. For the average person, whether a Roman farmer, a Babylonian merchant, or an Egyptian scribe, there was no trained healer nearby. There were no clinics, no diagnostics, no prescriptions. But there were ingredients, things your grandmother whispered about, things that stank, burned, soured, bubbled, things that had been passed down not in books, but in habits. And when your gut twisted, when your breath soured, when your child complained of itching or bloating, you did not pray first. You opened the cupboard. Garlic, the first line of defense, sharp, bitter, alive. In nearly every ancient culture, garlic was believed to have power, not just against spirits, but against infestations. It was chewed raw, sliced and swallowed with wine, ground into paste and smeared on the belly. In ancient Egypt, garlic was considered so valuable, it was fed to laborers building the pyramids to keep the body strong and free from inward decay. Medical papyri from the 16th century BCE describe it as a cleanser of the creeping thing that walks unseen. In Greece, Hippocrates recommended garlic for digestive pain, while later physicians used it to draw out worms from the belly. In India, Ayurvedic texts mixed garlic with ghee and black pepper as a general vermifuge, a word meaning worm expeller. It worked, to a point. Modern science has confirmed that allicin, a compound in crushed garlic, does have antiparasitic properties, but to be effective, it needed to be taken in large amounts that often left the user weak, sweaty, and exiled to a sleeping mat far from everyone else. Still, the smell was comforting. It meant someone was fighting back. Wine in the ancient world wasn't always for celebration. It was medicine. It was solvent. It was delivery system. In many home treatments, parasite-killing herbs were mixed into wine to make them more palatable or more potent. Wormwood, hyssop, and rue were steeped for days in dark jugs, then sipped slowly by the sick. Some cultures believed red wine, colored with the blood of the vine, could purify the intestines. In Roman texts, we find recipes for vinum vermicidum, worm-killing wine, infused with bitter bark. pepper, and occasionally powdered lead. Yes, lead. It was said to stun the worm, allowing it to be passed naturally. In medieval Islamic medicine, while alcohol was generally avoided, vinegar and sour fermented drinks served the same role, used to cut through phlegm and dry the dampness where illness hides. These treatments didn't always work, but wine made people feel braver, and sometimes that was half the cure. Where garlic scorched and wine burned, milk soothed, but it also deceived. One popular theory, found in sources from Persia to Sicily, was that parasites could be tricked into feeding on sweet milk, which would then coat and suffocate them. Patients were told to drink warm goat's milk with honey every morning on an empty stomach, then wait near a latrine. If all went well, the worm would slide free, seeking more sweetness. It was wishful thinking, perhaps, but goat's milk was also used as a carrier for other treatments, crushed seeds, ashes, or bitter herbs. In some traditions, children were fed milk mixed with crushed pomegranate rind or powdered figs, both mildly effective and far more palatable than garlic. In Jewish folk medicine, a glass of warm milk was often paired with whispered psalms for the worm that troubles sleep. It was both ritual and remedy, care and cure. Not every ingredient came from the kitchen. Some came from the ground. Leaves of wormwood, tansy and yarrow were boiled into teas or ground into poultices. These were believed to either kill the parasite directly or make the host unappealing. In the Celtic world, dried herbs were burned beside the bed of a sufferer, with the belief that the smoke would pass into the body and drive out what hides. In China, mugwort and ginger root were boiled together and consumed daily for a week, often followed by fasting or sweating. All of it shared a single belief that the body was a home, and you could make that home too hot, too bitter, too strange for the invader to stay, and so they swallowed. They pinched noses and gulped. They chewed with tears in their eyes. They drank until they trembled. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they passed the parasite and praised the heavens. Other times, they passed nothing and tried again tomorrow. But one thing was certain. They didn't wait, because to do nothing was to let the intruder win. And in every hut, every hearth, every echoing stone kitchen, where someone brewed a foul-smelling potion or mashed herbs into a sticky paste, there was one thought behind every swallow. Please, let this be the one that works. Some cures were bitter, some were strange, and some were deadly. In the battle against parasites, ancient people didn't always draw the line at safety. When the body felt invaded, when the gut twisted, or the skin bubbled, desperation took the reins. And desperation, as history shows, has a long and shimmering trail. That trail often glittered with mercury, called quicksilver by the Greeks and Romans. Mercury was a marvel. It flowed like water, but shone like metal. It reflected torchlight in dark rooms, danced in alchemical vessels, and was believed to contain properties no other substance could match. It was alive, magical, dangerous, and in some places, it was medicine. In ancient China, mercury, called cinnabar when in its red mineral form, was believed to hold the secret to longevity. Taoist alchemists consumed it in minute amounts, convinced it could cleanse the channels of the body and expel harmful energies, including, they believed, spiritual parasites. What they didn't realize was that mercury, while beautiful, was also toxic to the nervous system. Over time, those who used it medicinally developed tremors, confusion, ulcers, and sometimes madness. But for the afflicted, those plagued by bellyworms or ghosts of the blood, the risk was worth it. In Islamic medical texts, particularly those influenced by Persian scholars like Avicenna, mercury was sometimes included in ointments or purgative mixtures, not as a first line of defense, but as a last resort, used only when other remedies failed and the illness was considered deeply entrenched. Tiny doses, often mixed with vinegar or honey, were swallowed in the belief that the mercury would burn the invader from within. The cure often came with vomiting, diarrhea, and days of weakness. But if the parasite passed, the patient, and often the healer, considered the risk justified. In medieval Europe, particularly in later centuries, mercury became a staple treatment for syphilis, a disease often misdiagnosed alongside parasitic afflictions due to its strange array of symptoms: skin eruptions, fevers, wasting. Patients were told to lie in mercury vapor baths, sweating, and inhaling the fumes until the body purged the poison. Others were given mercurial pills, metallic gray and faintly sweet, to chew or dissolve under the tongue. Unsurprisingly, many became sicker than before. Yet even then, the logic persisted. If it's killing me, it might be killing the parasite too. While mercury glistened with danger, another substance, bitumen, promised a cure pulled from the earth's wounds. Bitumen is a sticky, tar-like material found oozing from the ground in certain regions of the ancient world, including the Dead Sea, Persia, and parts of Mesopotamia, used for waterproofing boats and mummification. Bitumen also found its way into medicine. Why? Because it was black, bitter, and binding. Healers believed that when mixed into wine, bitumen could bind parasites in the gut and force them to exit, either upward or downward. The logic was similar to clay. Coat the stomach, trap the worm, pass it out. In Babylonian texts, certain priests prepared a mixture of crushed dates, ash, and bitumen, shaped into pills and dried in the sun. These were swallowed over the course of 7 days, often accompanied by ritual fasting and fumigation of the home. Did it work? Sometimes. More often, it led to nausea, hallucinations, and constipation, followed by fever and weakness. But if a worm was passed, the treatment became legend. Even among the Romans, bitumen was applied to the skin as a salve for boils and worm-like afflictions of the flesh. The blackness, they believed, scared away the spirit causing the illness. It was also used to draw out infection, smeared over bites or sores, in the hope that what was hidden beneath would rise to the surface. Why would anyone swallow mercury? Why drink tar? The answer lies in a paradox that many ancient healers accepted. That which harms may also heal, if used with wisdom. This idea that a little poison could purge a larger one was embedded in the earliest philosophies of medicine. The balance of forces, the war between illness and antidote, the willingness to suffer a little to avoid suffering more, and for someone who had felt a parasite moving inside them, who had watched their child waste away despite eating, or scratched themselves raw in the night, mercury and bitumen weren't madness, they were hope. Burning, biting, choking hope. There were always warnings. Texts from as early as the 1st century BCE caution against overuse of the silver water. Babylonian scribes wrote, "Let no man drink tar in mourning, for he may join the dead before his sorrow ends." And yet, people still tried. Because when you believe something foreign has taken root inside you, when you feel occupied, invaded, infested, you will reach for anything that might set you free, even if it sparkles, even if it stings, even if it poisons you a little, before it saves you. There are strange things people will do for beauty, for strength, for the illusion of control. But the Romans, ingenious, ambitious, sometimes reckless, took this to a level that still feels unsettling today. Because when it came to tapeworms, they didn't just fight them, they used them. The Roman Empire loved indulgence. Feasts stretched for hours, with platters of roasted boar, honey-soaked figs, oysters, and wine, poured until the amphorae ran dry. But beneath this indulgence, there was a persistent cultural tension. Gluttony versus discipline. For soldiers, athletes, or the nobility, maintaining a fit body, one that could endure battles or display status, was important. And one unusual method, whispered among certain circles, involved a controlled infestation. It's believed that some Romans intentionally swallowed tapeworm eggs or larvae, often mixed into raw meat or goat's milk, with the idea that the parasite would consume excess food, helping the host stay lean even while feasting. It was, in their view, a partnership, a secret pact with a creature that lived silently inside, cleaning the excess as one indulged. Of course, the reality was far less glamorous. Tapeworms could grow several meters long, wrapping themselves within the intestines, causing malnutrition, dizziness, and, in severe cases, seizures. But the Romans, ever practical, also believed they could reset the body by combining this with fasting and purges. A typical process might look like this. Indulgence phase. A person would eat as much as desired for days, believing the tapeworm would absorb the excess. Fasting phase. The host would then starve themselves for 24-48 hours, forcing the worm to loosen its grip out of hunger. Expulsion phase. A strong purge would follow. often a mixture of vinegar, garlic, and bitter herbs, designed to drive the worm out, either through vomiting or natural passage. Accounts suggest that some people even dangled pieces of raw meat near their lips, believing the worm could smell the food and crawl upward to be removed. This is unlikely to have worked, but it persisted as folklore. Roman physicians were divided on the practice. Galen, the famous physician, warned against it, calling parasites thieves of the body. He preferred dietary control and herbal purges to letting a worm do the work. Yet others, like lesser-known rural healers, treated worms as a kind of natural cleansing mechanism, unpleasant but useful. For severe cases of intestinal blockage, some healers attempted worm removal by administering milk baths. The patient would sit in a warm tub of milk, believing the worm would emerge to seek food. In a few accounts, leeches were even applied to the abdomen during this process, as if to help draw the spirit of the worm outward. This fascination with tapeworms wasn't limited to Rome. In parts of ancient India and China, there were similar ideas about using parasites as cleansers, though typically under the guidance of healers rather than for vanity. The difference was that these cultures also emphasized balancing the body after such treatments with restorative broths, herbs, and meditation. The Romans, however, often went too far. Some wealthy patrons reportedly traded secret recipes for cultivating worms, seeing them as a form of luxury cleansing. This led to rumors, whispered in forums and bathhouses, that certain actresses or gladiators were unnaturally lean because they fed their shadows, meaning they hosted tapeworms. The results were not always pretty. Chronic anemia, sudden fainting, severe cramps, and of course death. But even when the practice was recognized as dangerous, the whispers never really stopped. The idea that something living inside you could eat your mistakes was too tempting. Imagine the moment when indulgence turned to regret. A noble woman, pale and trembling, clutching her stomach as the physician murmurs about the thing that feeds within. A soldier, vomiting after a failed expulsion, swearing never to eat raw goat's liver again. A cook, secretly feeding garlic-soaked bread to his master, hoping to kill the pet worm that's making him weak. These moments remind us that while history might look golden in statues and mosaics, the truth was much grittier. The Romans, like us, wanted shortcuts. They wanted the impossible, to eat endlessly, to stay strong, to avoid consequence. But the body does not forget, and the worm, once welcome, did not always leave. Though it may sound like ancient madness, this idea has not entirely died, even in the 19th and 20th centuries. Tapeworm diets resurfaced in parts of Europe and America, often packaged as miracle slimming pills. The same gamble, the same regret, the same haunting truth that something alive inside you could take everything, including your life. The Romans weren't foolish, they were human. And when human desire collides with desperation, strange remedies are born. In the cool silence of ancient apothecaries, beneath the fluttering banners of bamboo script, and the scent of boiling roots, Chinese medicine unfolded with both precision and poetry. While the West burned with purges and poisons, traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, approached parasites like it approached all illness, through balance. A parasite was not just an invader. It was a symptom of disharmony, an imbalance between heat and cold, yin and yang, qi and stagnation. And the cure, it would not come from violence. It would come from plants. In ancient Chinese writings, there is a term, gruel. Gru is a complex word, sometimes meaning poison, sometimes referring to parasitic infestation, sometimes even describing cursed objects or spirits. But at its root, gru represents the idea of something that lives within, feeding silently on its host. Early texts describe gru as a creature born of decay, of rotting food or stagnant water, which enters the human body through the mouth or skin. It nests in the stomach. It grows strong when one's qi, or life energy, is weak. It causes bloating, nightmares, forgetfulness, and madness. The cure, restore the balance, expel the rot, nourish what was weakened. And so, the herbalist begins, tall, bitter, aromatic. Wormwood was one of the oldest weapons in the TCM cabinet against internal parasites. Its bitter essence was believed to cool excess heat in the blood and intestines, heat that parasites loved, boiled into tea or mixed with rice gruel. Wormwood was prescribed for symptoms of grue, abdominal swelling, skin rashes, foul breath, and vivid dreams of snakes or insects. Wormwood didn't just drive out parasites. It changed the terrain. It made the host inhospitable. It was said that no thing that wriggles will stay where Qinghao grows. Centuries later, scientists would isolate artemisinin, a compound in wormwood, and realize it's one of the most effective anti-malarial agents known to medicine. The ancients weren't wrong. They just didn't need to explain why it worked. They only needed to know that it worked. Not the sweet pink stalks of pie fillings, but the dark, bitter root of the medicinal rhubarb plant, used sparingly and always with caution. Da Huang was known as a powerful purgative. The goal, force movement. Dislodge the parasite, expel it with speed. Rhubarb root was often paired with warming herbs like ginger to prevent cramping. It was decocted for hours into a thick, earthy tea, cool to the tongue, hot to the belly. Symptoms it addressed: sluggish bowels, distension, foul-smelling stools, and ghost feelings in the gut. In some Taoist circles, Da Huang was said to shake loose the spirits of rot, sending them back to the earth. Too much, however, could weaken the patient, so it was balanced with licorice, jujube, or lotus seed, gentler herbs that soothed after the storm. In a more elite corner of Chinese medicine, reserved for royalty, warriors, and the wealthy, came Hu Dan, the dried bile of a tiger's gallbladder. Rare, expensive, revered, tiger gall was thought to possess cooling and clarifying energy, capable of cleansing the liver, sharpening vision, and killing stubborn internal parasites. It was powdered and swallowed in wine or hot broth. Some formulas combined it with hornet's nest, bear bile, or snake skin, amplifying its potency in fighting deep illness. Tiger bile was not used lightly. It was often part of exorcistic medicine, where parasite and demon were treated as one. The patient might be asked to fast, sleep beside incense, and wear yellow silk charms while undergoing treatment. Today, the use of tiger bile is widely condemned and illegal in most places due to ethical concerns and wildlife protection. But in ancient times, it was viewed as harnessing the ferocity of the tiger to drive out the hidden enemy. Areca nut, bing lang, often chewed or boiled into tea, thought to paralyze parasites and lubricate the gut. Pumpkin seed, nanguazi, mild but effective against tapeworms, used especially for children. Black walnut hulls, used in some border regions of China, known for their bitter strength and cleansing properties. Coptis, huanglian, antibacterial and antiparasitic, prescribed for damp heat in the intestines. In every case, the herbalist worked like a calligrapher, balancing hot and cold, moving and still, bitter and sweet, because to cure the parasite wasn't just to destroy it. It was to restore the terrain, to calm the wind, to ask the body to return to itself. Imagine the scene. A child with a swollen belly sits on a mat. Steam curls from a clay bowl of bitter broth. The herbalist, quiet and precise, checks the tongue, the pulse, the eyes. He writes not with pen, but with roots, placing each ingredient into the pot like a poem. The room smells of bark, stone, fire, and something ancient. The child sips and waits. Not just to purge, but to return, to wake up in a body that feels like home again. If plants were medicine for the wise, animals were often medicine for the desperate. In nearly every corner of the ancient world, healers turned to creatures, living, dead, or symbolic, to help treat what squirmed and hid inside the human body. Sometimes they mimicked the parasite, sometimes they overpowered it, and sometimes, disturbingly, they were invited inside. Let's walk through some of the most unusual, often unsettling, and deeply symbolic animal-based remedies, once used to evict the unwanted from the body. Among some rural communities in ancient Egypt, India, and parts of Eastern Europe, a strange belief circulated. If you swallowed a live froglet just hatched, barely squirming, it would hunt down the worms in your belly and eat them. It was more than folklore, it was ritual. The patient, often a child, was made to fast for a day. Then the frog, freshly caught and washed in sacred water, was quickly swallowed whole. A prayer might be whispered, "Let the frog find what wriggles. Let the frog feed. Let the frog die clean." The logic was painfully literal. If a worm lives in me, let another animal take its place. In some cases, frogs weren't swallowed alive, but dried, powdered, and mixed into tea. The idea persisted. Use a devourer to devour the devourer. Did it work? Probably not. But the psychological effect, for the parents, for the patient, was powerful. Something had been done. Something active. Something wild. And sometimes, that was enough to calm the suffering, if not the cause. In ancient Babylonia, parts of Greece, and some Jewish mystical traditions, dogs were both feared and revered, symbols of impurity and guardians against evil. In certain healing rituals, particularly for skin parasites like scabies or burrowing mites, patients were instructed to wear a strip of cured dog skin around their midsection, thigh, or neck. It was believed that the dog, being a creature of loyalty and filth, had the power to absorb or distract spirits of disease. The parasite would leave its host to take up residence in the unclean pelt. One Babylonian tablet reads, "Let the skin of the dog confuse the eater of skin. Let it bite what it finds familiar." In other cases, the skin wasn't worn, but burned. Its smoke inhaled to drive out invisible worms of the breath. There's even a record from early Roman folk medicine in which a child with lice was wrapped in a fresh dog pelt for a night, then washed at dawn. The idea was that the lice would crawl into the fur, mistaking it for the true host. It's hard to know how widespread or successful this practice was, but it reminds us of something profound. Ancient people understood that parasites followed the rules of nature, so they used nature, smelly, hairy, hungry nature, as a trap. Where fire and poison failed, some healers turned to a softer method, appeasement. In ancient summer, some priests believed that certain stomach worms, particularly tapeworms, were not enemies, but residents, guests. Intruders, yes, but not necessarily hostile if fed, so instead of killing them outright, you could bribe them to leave. One common practice was to drink a mix of honey, dates, and goat milk, believed to entice the worm with sweetness. After days of drinking this mixture, the patient would fast. On the third day, a large portion of bitter herbs was consumed. The goal? Starve the host. Feed the worm. Then poison the worm's food. Another variation appears in Persian texts, where a spoonful of honey was swallowed first thing in the morning, followed by slow breathing and belly massage, believed to guide the worm toward the stomach, where it could be purged. The worm was treated like a clever thief. You didn't catch it by force. You baited it and hoped it came to you on its own. Crushed beetles. In early African and Egyptian treatments, dried beetles were ground and added to wine as a supposed intestinal stimulant. Boiled mouse soup, found in some Roman countryside healing recipes, used primarily for children with fevers and diarrhea. Mice were believed to be full of earth energy and could draw sickness away. Snakeskin powder. In Indian Ayurvedic texts, dried snakeskin was sometimes burned and mixed with turmeric to treat invisible skin invaders. Lice from the hair of the healthy. In a bizarre reverse charm, some cultures believed that transferring lice from a healthy person's hair to a sick person's scalp could replace the bad infestation with a manageable one, because animals were symbolic, because animals were messengers, because in a world without microscopes, it was easy to believe that what lived within us could be bargained with using what lived outside of us. And because sometimes, when your child is crying, when your belly won't stop gurgling, when you've tried everything else, you reach for the frog, you wrap yourself in fur, you offer honey to the invisible thing, and hope it's listening. When all else failed, when the herbs didn't work, when the spirits didn't leave, when the belly still ached, and the skin still crawled, there remained one final, terrible option. Reset the body, wipe the slate clean, force the invader out. Not gently, not symbolically, but through sheer violence of function. This was the philosophy behind the ancient practices of bloodletting and purging. a belief that the body could be flushed, bled, or emptied into health. The logic was harsh. But to the desperate, it felt like hope. The idea that bad blood caused illness dates back thousands of years. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was believed that pain in the gut or limbs indicated that blood demons had become trapped inside the body, swollen with impurity. Letting that blood out, through cuts or leeches, was a way to let the spirit escape. In Greece and Rome, bloodletting became highly formalized. The body, according to Hippocrates, contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of any one created imbalance. Parasites, especially those of the gut and skin, were thought to result from excess blood heat, so the solution: let it out. A physician would inspect the patient's veins and determine the best place to bleed them, usually the forearm, ankle, or behind the ear. The amount varied. A small incision might be made, and blood drawn into a bowl until the patient became pale, lightheaded, or nauseous. In India, Ayurvedic practitioners practiced a gentler form called rectamokshana, where a few drops of blood were drawn with fine instruments or leeches, especially near the abdomen, to relieve internal congestion. Even in medieval Europe, parasite symptoms were often treated with bleeding, especially when accompanied by fever, rash, or swelling. Surgeons kept color-coded bowls for different types of sickness, and the patient's blood was examined for worm signs, threads, clots, or discoloration that hinted at infestation. Of course, many patients were already weak. Bleeding them sometimes tipped them over the edge, but when faced with the sense that something was inside, doing nothing felt worse. If bloodletting was about fluids, purging was about movement. Force the parasite out through vomiting, diarrhea, or both. Ancient texts are filled with harsh recipes for purging tonics. In Egypt, a mixture of crushed sycamore bark and goose fat was taken before sunrise. In Rome, purgatives included bitter vetch, sea salt, and boiled wine vinegar, taken in increasing doses until the stomach turned. In China, herbs like de huang, rhubarb root, fuzi, aconite, and huamaren, hemp seed, were combined to clean the intestines of stagnation and lingering ghosts. In India, castor oil and cow urine, boiled with triphala, were taken in dawn rituals meant to cleanse the gut and spirit. The results were brutal. Cramps, sweats, hallucinations, collapse, but sometimes relief, even if the parasite didn't leave. The sense that the body had been forcibly emptied was empowering. Some called it purification, others rebirth, and many called it the only thing that ever worked. Other forms of reset followed the same logic. Sweating huts were used in Africa, North America, and Northern Europe to boil the worm from within. Starvation fasts were prescribed in Persia and Judea to deprive the parasite of food and weaken its grip. In one strange medieval German tradition, patients were placed on a slowly spinning table, spun until vomiting, in the belief that dizziness confused the spirit within. Each method had the same goal: force what doesn't belong to let go. There's something heartbreaking in these treatments, and something brave: to bleed yourself, to drink ash, to starve for 7 days, to spin until the world goes white, not because you're sure it will work, but because you cannot live another day with the itch, the bloating, the crawling, the fear. To the ancient sufferer, parasites weren't just biological. They were violations of the body, of dignity, of quiet sleep. So they fought, even when it hurt, even when it left scars, because to do nothing was to surrender your body entirely. And ancient people, however humble, however afraid, rarely surrendered. They swallowed fire, they drank dirt, they risked poison, all in the hope of silence, a still belly, a clear mind, a night without scratching. But not everyone suffered equally. Because in the next chapter, we'll shift our gaze upward to the silk sheets, perfumed wigs, and gilded ointments of the wealthy. We'll see how class shaped not just the experience of parasites, but how well you could hide them. It's easy to imagine that the rich of the ancient world lived lives of scented oils and spotless linen beyond the crawl of lice, the bite of fleas, the squirm of worms. But that's a fantasy. The truth? Even kings scratched. Even queens whispered to healers in the dark. Even emperors soaked their bellies in bitter wine, praying for peace within. Still, there was a difference. Not in whether they were infested, but in how well they could hide it. In many ancient societies, access to water was power. Clean water, hot water, private water. The poor washed in rivers, muddy, communal, full of reeds and runoff. The rich had basins, attendants and marble tubs, and sometimes even bathhouses. These weren't just places to bathe. They were places to flee infestation. In the Roman Empire, the thermae were public bathhouses, open to most but with tiers of experience. Wealthy citizens had personal bathing rooms, with heated floors and steamy caldariums. They were scrubbed with olive oil, scraped with strigils, and massaged with scented balms after. Parasites, particularly lice and fleas, were picked out by slaves or attendants with fine combs. For the elite, this wasn't just hygiene. It was ceremony. It was status. It was a way to smell of cypress and citrus rather than sweat and straw, while the poor might bathe once a week, if that. The rich could cleanse daily, ensuring that lice had little time to settle and skin parasites had less chance to take hold. In ancient Egypt, ritual cleanliness was paramount, especially for priests. Before entering temples, they shaved their bodies, donned white linen, and bathed in sacred pools 4 times a day. Parasites were considered spiritually unclean, and the elite had access to oils, clays, and attendants who helped remove lice from wigs and linens. Even outside the priesthood, nobles could afford private bathing courtyards, complete with servants trained in combing, scrubbing, and fumigating rooms with herbs like frankincense and myrrh. For the poor, bathing meant waiting for flood season or stealing water from irrigation channels. They bathed with ash when they could, or they didn't bathe at all. In Vedic India, the concept of saucha, purity, guided both personal and ritual hygiene. The elite had access to stone tubs, herbal oils, and perfumed soaps made from chickpea flour, turmeric, and sandalwood. Bathing was done at sunrise, often with a servant pouring water over the bather from copper vessels. In imperial China, royal courtyards included heated pools, tea leaf infusions, and special cloths embroidered with protective symbols against evil winds and crawling spirits. The emperor's bedding was changed daily. Robes were burned if deemed unclean, and his physicians were trained not just in healing, but in prevention, fumigating rooms with herbs, inspecting palace pets, and applying vermifuge tonics discreetly to anyone who seemed bloated or sluggish. It's important to remember, the rich were not spared. They still suffered from parasites. They just had the means to treat them early, to suffer in private, to mask the symptoms. A noblewoman with lice would retreat to a cleansing room. A king with belly worms would call for powdered silver or fresh figs. A merchant with fleas could burn his tunic and buy another. The poor, they wore the same clothes until they rotted. They itched openly. They passed parasites from one sleeping mat to the next, like curses that couldn't be outrun. Access to a bathhouse wasn't just about water. It was a threshold. On one side, relief, privacy, scented oils, clean fingers lifting combs through your hair. On the other, dust, sweat, infection, and the constant companionship of things that bit. Bathing was a pause, a privilege, a kind of soft armor, and for the elite, it helped them pretend, if only for a while, that their bodies were theirs alone. But even the best oils can't reach every shadow. Even the richest robes can hide a rash. So they bathed and perfumed and paid others to whisper about it instead of scream, because infestation among the poor was seen as expected. Among the elite, it was scandal. If the poor scratched in the open, the rich disguised the itch, because in palaces and courts, in noble homes behind carved doors and silken curtains, parasites were not simply pests. They were embarrassments, proof that despite the robes, the rings, the titles, the body still betrayed, and so began a long tradition of covering up the crawl. Not with cures, but with distractions. In ancient Persia, Greece, and later throughout medieval Europe, nobles wore layers of perfumed oil and powder, not just to smell sweet, but to smother the smell of infestation. Because lice have a scent, rotting skin has a scent, infected bites have a scent, and even the best bathhouse can't reach the corners of a heavily wigged scalp or a triple-layered tunic worn in winter. So perfumers became defenders of dignity. They crafted oils of lavender, myrrh, rose, and cinnamon, sometimes mixed with crushed insects or rare resins. These were applied not just to the wrists and neck, but underarms, behind ears, and along the hairline, where lice loved to hide. In Renaissance France, nobles wore pomanders, tiny scented orbs hung from belts or necklaces, filled with ambergris, civet, or clove-studded citrus. Some were purely for fragrance, others were meant to repel parasites, creating a scent barrier the insects supposedly avoided. By the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in Europe, powdered wigs became fashion and problem. Beneath the towering curls and ribbons, scalps were often unwashed, covered with lice, mites, and scabs. To hide this, nobles applied generous amounts of powder, often a mix of rice flour, arrowroot, or plaster of Paris, tinted with dyes and scented with lavender or bergamot. The result? A glorious cloud of whiteness that concealed a seething world beneath. Servants were tasked with removing lice from wigs by boiling, steaming, or placing them in special cedar-lined boxes overnight. Some wigs even had removable lice patches, small cloth pads meant to absorb infestations so they could be burned separately. But even with all the attention, the truth remained. Many nobles lived with chronic scalp conditions, itchy welts, and festering bites, hidden beneath layers of style and scent. It was the illusion of hygiene. A court performance, a whispered dance of denial. The same strategy extended to the face and skin. Mites, particularly scabies and demodex, were common among the elite, especially those who shared clothing or bedding during travel or court stays. Rather than treat the infestation, nobles often masked the symptoms. White lead makeup concealed red patches or sores, beauty patches, velvet stars or circles glued to the skin covered scars or bites. Lace collars and sleeves distracted the eye from scratching motions. Women were trained to fan themselves with one hand while discreetly scratching with the other. Men carried canes with ivory-handled combs inside, allowing for secret scalp relief mid-conversation. For the rich, how you smelled wasn't just about pleasure, it was about power. To smell of crushed rose petals and sandalwood meant you had access. To reek of sweat or rot meant you belonged to the wrong side of the street. Perfume became a class wall. Powder became a curtain. The crawl still happened, but behind it, the illusion held. In court, no one commented on the scratching of a duchess. No one acknowledged the flakes in a bishop's wig. A servant might be flogged for pointing out lice on a noble child. Infestation among the elite wasn't less common. It was simply less visible because it was less allowed. So they powdered, they perfumed, they prayed in secret, and when they scratched, they did so with style. In a world without antibiotics, without antiseptic soaps or sealed bedding, true cleanliness was rare. But if you had enough money, you could come close. Not because you were immune, not because the parasites feared your crown, but because wealth could buy barriers. Soft, shimmering, silver-tipped barriers between your body and the crawl. Welcome to the quiet war of silk and silver. For most people, beds were made of straw, wool, or plant fiber, packed into linen or coarse sacks, and laid over wooden slats. These materials, absorbent, fibrous, often shared by many, became ideal environments for fleas, bedbugs, and mites. But the rich, they slept on silk, not just for the sheen or the status, but because silk, smooth, tightly woven, naturally resistant to moisture and pests, acted like a kind of passive shield. In Tang Dynasty China, royal bedchambers were layered in silk. Silk sheets, silk pillows, even silk wall hangings. Silk was considered not just luxurious, but medicinal, believed to cool the fire of the blood and repel crawling spirits. In Persia, emperors had their bedding sewn from double-woven silk and washed weekly in rose water. The washing itself was performed by specialists who knew how to dry the fabric under moonlight, believed to preserve its spiritual lightness. In France, silk bed linens became fashionable among the aristocracy by the 17th century. The queen's bed was changed daily, a separate mattress was kept for summer, lighter and less likely to harbor heat-loving mites. And beyond the practical, it looked expensive. It smelled expensive. It made a statement. Nothing impure touches me, even if that wasn't true. For the poor, a lice comb was a carved bone or splintered stick, if they had one at all. For the rich, it was silver. In ancient Rome, India, and medieval Europe, silver combs weren't just grooming tools, they were protective charms. Silver was believed to possess purifying properties. It stayed cool, it resisted tarnish, and it symbolized moonlight and cleanliness, opposite to the darkness of infestation. Mothers combed their daughters' hair with silver-toothed combs each morning, often while singing or praying. The act was both intimate and medical, searching for nits, calming the scalp, and spreading oils that were believed to repel lice. In some cultures, these combs were passed down like heirlooms, stored in silk-lined boxes, used only on feast days or before ceremonies. Even men who rarely showed vanity kept silver beard combs, hidden inside belt pouches or tucked into writing desks. Not everyone believed they worked, but no one wanted to be the only noble at court, scratching his temple with a kitchen fork. Luxury extended beyond the bed and comb. Treatalob. Canopies of velvet or gauze were hung over beds to block insects, sometimes scented with wormwood or sage. Ivory inlaid trunks were used to store bedding between seasons, lined with cedar shavings or dried lavender. Jeweled brooches secretly contained flea powder or crushed camphor, ready to be tapped into a handkerchief when needed. Some nobles even commissioned flea traps, tiny cages of lace and sugar, worn under sleeves or bodices to attract fleas away from the body. Parasite prevention became a form of craftsmanship, an industry of invisibility, art built to protect you from shame. But silk tears, combs miss things, silver tarnishes, and parasites, as always, find the cracks. There are letters from noblewomen in medieval Spain, describing nights spent awake with itching scalps. Notes from Persian scholars complaining that fleas still found their way into sandalwood-scented sheets. Even in the cleanest rooms, the quietest chambers, the parasites waited. They didn't care about your coins. They only cared that you were warm, soft, and still. And so the rich combed, they boiled, they perfumed. They embroidered protection into every thread, not because they believed they were safe, but because they could not bear to be seen suffering like the poor. They ruled continents. They signed decrees in ink and blood. They wore crowns of gold and ermine. And still they scratched, because not even kings were spared the torment of head lice. But unlike peasants, they didn't scratch in the open. No, they scratched through ceremony, through servants, through rituals of quiet desperation. This is the royal scratch. You'd think a crown would be the most protective headwear in the world, solid, heavy, gleaming, but underneath, a sweaty padded band, velvet lined, rarely clean, in hot climates or extended ceremonies. Kings wore it for hours, sometimes days without removing it, and lice, opportunistic and enduring, thrived in the warmth. But unlike the poor, kings couldn't simply remove a cap and dig in with their nails. No dignity had to be preserved, so they had help. In the courts of medieval France and early Renaissance England, certain valets were assigned a specific task to tend to the royal scalp. These were often trusted attendants or grooms of the bedchamber, trained to detect the first signs of infestation, redness at the nape, visible nits behind the ears, irritation near the temples. They used fine ivory combs, dipped in rosemary-infused oils or white wine, to gently scrape along the scalp. It was done in private, often at night, by candlelight, with the windows shuttered. In some courts, this practice was formalized, recorded in royal routines as scalp grooming or crown cleansing. To be invited into this ritual was a sign of deep trust, but it was also a humbling reminder. Even kings needed help with the bugs. Royal physicians had access to the most expensive ingredients. Whether or not they worked was a different matter entirely. Here are a few lice treatments reserved for royalty. Crushed emerald and vinegar paste, applied to the scalp to blind the lice. Boiled gold thread tonic, believed to electrify the crown chakra and expel crawling demons. musk-infused lard, smeared under wigs or hats to suffocate parasites, foxglove tinctures, applied in small amounts though dangerously toxic. In India, sandalwood and neem oil were favored among royal families, applied during moonlit scalp massages performed by trained masseurs. In China, green tea infusions and jade combs were used by the emperor's concubines to clean one another's hair, both as grooming and courtly bonding. But the most common treatment? Heat. Steam rooms, scented with herbs, hot cloths pressed to the scalp, hair dried in the sun, combed repeatedly while sitting in shade. It wasn't fast, it wasn't always effective, but it felt like action, and that mattered. Royal portraits show flawless curls, golden beards, powdered hairlines, but just off canvas, scratching, wincing, rubbing the scalp under the table at court dinners. Some monarchs took drastic steps. Queen Elizabeth I used lead-based makeup to cover facial sores, many believed to be caused by mange-like mites. They wore rings of amber, which were thought to repel insects. They burned bundles of sage and juniper in their bedchambers nightly, and they paid handsomely for silence, because while poverty itched, power denied. Imagine ruling a kingdom, negotiating wars, hosting visiting monarchs, and all the while, a crawling itch beneath your crown, a constant whisper of something small, invading something sacred. Kings and queens didn't talk about it, but their diaries did. Their letters did. Their attendants' journals did. They felt shame, yes, but also frustration, helplessness, and resentment toward their bodies. Because what's the point of absolute power if you still can't stop the itch? So they scratched, with silver combs, with heated oils, with trusted hands in the shadows, and in the morning, they sat on their thrones, straight-backed, unsmiling, as if they hadn't spent the night at war with their own skin. We think of parasites as a mark of poverty, but some of the most grotesque infestations thrived inside palaces because luxury masked, but it didn't protect. Fine food, imported delicacies, endless feasting, they came at a price, paid in worms, not on the skin, within. From the courts of Versailles to the temples of Thebes, the rich weren't just hosts to flattery and spies. They were hosts to tapeworms, roundworms, and pinworms. Royal banquets were legendary. Tables groaned under glazed meats, raw fruits, foreign cheeses, imported fish, and milk-soaked pastries. In many palaces, food was stored in wooden crates. Open-air pantries were stone larders, cool but far from sterile. Sanitation, minimal. Food tasting was done for poison, not for parasites. And exotic dishes often meant undercooked meats or contaminated produce. Tapeworms from undercooked pork, liver flukes from raw freshwater fish, Ascaris giant roundworms from unwashed vegetables, grown in human fertilizer, pinworms from linens and bedchambers, shared during court visits. Even delicacies like caviar, figs, and imported dates could carry microscopic eggs, ready to hatch in the warmth of a noble's gut. The poor screamed when the pain hit. The rich whispered it to their physicians, because you don't admit publicly that your belly bloats after every feast, that you wake up sweating, nauseous, unable to eat, that your servants noticed worms in the chamber pot. Instead, a princess simply retired early after dinner. A duke began taking long fasts for spiritual reflection. A king requested cool compresses for his unexplained fever. Behind the tapestries, behind the perfume and pomp, worms wriggled through intestines, grew fat on roast lamb and candied fruits, and no amount of wealth could buy them out. Elite treatments were elaborate and often useless. Court physicians created concoctions from ground pearls and crushed coral, mixed with honey, boiled garlic wine, sipped in increments over 9 days, powdered emeralds and cinnamon bark, wormwood infusions so bitter they made patients vomit, sometimes violently enough to eject intestinal worms. In India, neem leaf paste was applied to the abdomen while chants were recited. In Rome, gladiators were given vinegar enemas, later adopted by the nobility. In medieval Europe, noble women consumed quicksilver, mercury, in tiny doses, believing it would drive worms into madness and expulsion. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it killed them. Servants changed the chamber pots. They laundered soiled linens. They burned undergarments, ruined by illness. They saw things. They weren't supposed to speak of them, but whispers spread. The Duchess sleeps with her knees to her chest now. The prince won't eat figs anymore. The queen's wine is boiled, and yet she still grows pale. Parasites were an unspoken truth in elite life. Like disease, like madness, like corruption, they were endured behind curtains, wrapped in protocol, and buried beneath velvet. In courtly language, the word worm was poetic. He is a worm in my heart. Her beauty worms its way into the soul. But in private, the term struck dread, because the real worms were in the stomach, the liver, the lungs, some growing feet long, shedding segments daily, defiling the bodies they inhabited. A noble body wasn't sacred, it was a host, and sometimes the only sign of nobility was how many servants were required to clean up the consequences. So the rich prayed, they fasted, they purged, but the worms always returned, because parasites don't care about silk. They don't care about pearls. They care that you eat well and sleep warm. And so, hidden inside the bodies that ruled the world, life crawled on. Parasites didn't discriminate, but history did, because while worms curled in the bellies of kings, and lice nested under powdered wigs, and mites crept beneath the lace sleeves of duchesses, the blame was always placed downward, on the peasants, the laborers, the market women, the barefoot child in the street. This is the story of projection, of public shame, and of a long, curated lie, that parasites were the mark of the unclean, not the unlucky. To preserve the illusion of nobility, the elite began crafting a narrative, one that painted parasites as the natural companions of poverty. They said, "Lice were born of sloth, not cloth. Worms grew in the bellies of the unwashed, not the overfed. Mites and fleas were the price of bad breeding, not bad linens." They associated infestation with moral failure, a sign that someone was too lazy to boil their water, too careless to mind their hygiene, too lowborn to know better. And once that idea took root, it stuck. In many cities across medieval and early modern Europe, laws were passed forbidding the visibly infested from entering markets, churches, or public baths. A woman with lice was called a carrier of pestilence. A man with fleas might be barred from trade. A child with scabies might be removed from school, if schooling was allowed in the first place. But these laws rarely touched the noble class. Why? Because the symptoms of the poor were seen, the symptoms of the rich were masked. Perfume, powder, privacy. They could hide the crawl, but the poor, exposed and unperfumed, could not. Writers and poets fed the fire. They mocked the flea-ridden farmer, the scratching beggar, the worm-plagued washerwoman. Woodcuts and plays caricatured the poor as walking nests of filth, too brutish to care, too backward to improve. And meanwhile, noble courts paid in secret for their boilings, their combings, their vomit-inducing tinctures. It was one of history's most successful cover-ups. The body still suffered, but the reputation did not. When nobles did offer help, medicine, clean linens, access to herbs, it came with strings. The poor had to confess, publicly. They had to stand in lines labeled unclean, wear ribbons or tokens, marking their impurity, sometimes even shave their heads for inspection. This charity was less about healing and more about reinforcing the hierarchy. The message was simple. Uninvited, you are dirty. We are not, even when both shared the same lice. Churches also played their part. In many sermons, parasites were described as punishments, God's reminder to the idle, the sinful, the lustful. Monks wrote about scabies as a metaphor for spiritual rot. Worms were symbols of the unrepentant soul, eating itself from within. The rich donated to leper colonies. They built separate pews for the infested. They gave coin to hospitals, so long as they never had to see the patients. And in private they scratched, quietly, with servants holding mirrors. Even today, traces of that narrative remain. Lice infested like the slums, Only poor people get worms. But parasites never cared about class. They cared about conditions. And often, the same nobleman who passed laws against infestation was chewing a clove to mask his own sour breath, his belly bloated with worms, his scalp dusted with powder to hide the itching. Many of the most successful parasite treatments in history came from the folk knowledge of the poor. Pliab Ding believes, burned rosemary, ash rubbed into the scalp, sleeping with mint under the pillow, hanging herbs in doorways. These methods, dismissed by elites as peasant magic, were quietly adopted, refined, renamed, and sold back to the wealthy as physicians' wisdom. The poor weren't always infested. They were just seen. And the rich weren't always clean. They were just protected by curtains. So history remembered the crawling shame as a poor man's plague, but it was always everyone's burden, just hidden better in marble halls. And now, as we leave the perfumed halls and return to the quiet night, let's reflect. What does it mean to be clean when even the crown cannot keep the crawl away? Now that we've wandered through the chambers of kings and the cottages of peasants, now that we've scratched beneath the powdered wigs and peered into the chamber pots of palaces, what are we left with? The truth that whispers, quiet but constant. To be human is to host. We are kingdoms unto ourselves, skin stretched over valleys, lungs like cathedrals, a gut full of mysteries, and for most of human history, we were never alone in those bodies. Parasites didn't just invade us, they lived with us, on us, in us. Despite us, they shaped how we bathed, how we ate, how we touched each other in the dark. They made us invent rituals, scrub the bedposts with lemon peels, hang sage bundles in the rafters, comb our children's hair by candlelight. They made us superstitious, they made us inventive, they made us aware. Even now, in our sanitized homes with anti-parasitic soap and filtered water, we still feel that ancestral itch, because memory lives in the body, even if we've forgotten the cause. They taught us hierarchy, who got silk and who got straw. They taught us shame, what could be spoken and what must be hidden. They taught us patience, how to live with the things we couldn't see but always felt. And maybe, in a strange way, they taught us empathy, because when you've lain awake with something crawling on your skin, when you've scratched until it bled, when you've boiled your sheets and begged for relief, you understand suffering that's small, persistent, and invisible. You understand the burden of enduring something no one else can see. We spend so much of our lives chasing clean skin, clean homes, clean histories, but parasites remind us that cleanliness is not purity, it's maintenance, a ritual, a hope. Because the body is never truly sterile. It's busy, alive, in constant negotiation with what wants to live beside it. And maybe that's not failure, maybe that's nature. As you lay your head down in a modern bed beneath a quiet ceiling fan or the hush of city night, you might feel a little itch. It's probably nothing, a stray hair, a fold in the sheet, the memory of something ancient and tiny and clever. But if it's more, if something is crawling, take a breath. You're part of a story that's older than kings, older than war, older than even the idea of medicine, a story of survival, of coexistence, whether we liked it or not. Sleep softly tonight, and if the itch comes, scratch like a king.